Our focus is on Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is on a two-day visit to China. He's met Chinese President Xi Jinping in Wuhan city on Friday in 3 separate occasions. This is a cultural event that he witnessed at the local provincial museum. Both leaders have stressed on resetting bilateral relations that were strained in the backdrop of the Doklam crisis. On the second day, that's today, of his visit, the Prime Minister will attend a private lunch hosted by the Chinese President. The Prime Minister will also take a boat ride accompanied by Xi Jinping at the East Lake. Earlier on Friday, the two leaders held delegation-level talks where the Indian Prime Minister emphasized on making such informal summits a tradition. He also invited the Chinese President to India next year for an informal summit. India and China have expressed the desire to stabilize bilateral military relations and to increase people-to-people contact. This meeting is different from past encounters because it's informal, one-on-one, and involves a lot of open conversations rather than being a planned and a choreographed diplomatic summit.
संसार की शांति, स्थिरता और समृद्धि की दिशा में भारत और चीन चल रहे हैं। मैं उसमें 5 बहुत पॉजिटिव एलिमेंट देख रहा हूं। हमारे बीच की सोच, हमारे बीच का संपर्क, हमारे बीच का सहयोग, हमारे बीच के समान संकल्प, हमारे बीच के समान सपने, ये 5 एलिमेंट ऐसे हैं: सोच, संपर्क, सहयोग, सपने, संकल्प, विश्व शांति, विश्व स्थिरता, विश्व समृद्धि, इसकी ताकत बन सकते हैं।
Joining us now in our studios is Professor Swaran Singh, a professor in the School of International Studies at JNU, and from Beijing, we're joined by Ener Tangen, who's a political and economic commentator. Professor, we don't know much of what happened during the delegation-level talks. We do know that they were only scheduled for half an hour, but apparently went on for 2 hours. The only other information we have is from the Prime Minister's tweet so far, saying that they were extensive, the talks.
I think most meetings have gone beyond the time limit, and dinner meeting itself and the cultural program also, and the fact that President Xi Jinping came all the way to the car to see him off at end of the day. There's enormous orchestration of bonhomie from the Chinese side. As I was just seeing your television, the front line, almost 2/3 of the page of a newspaper is covered with the big picture. And that's unusual. And that kind of cultivating India is very much up in display. And today is that part where they're going to publicly showcase, they're going to walk in public, they're going to have a boat ride which will be all on televisions. And I think yesterday they kind of gauged each other together and prepared as to how they will demonstrate and showcase that body language today to the rest of the world. Sure. And it's quite a display of, at least personal bonhomie chemistry. Whether that results...
That is the idea, I guess, of this
The whole purpose is to showcase, particularly because West is now moving in another way of anti-immigration, protectionism, and it seems China and to some extent India are emerging as leaders of free trade and globalization. And Chinese need to showcase that India and China are together. Whether the bilateral issues will be resolved, managed, that's a matter that we'll come to know much later. Maybe just managed, not resolved at this stage.
Sure.
But showcasing that global projection, global leadership on together tackling several global issues. I think that's the purpose here, and unusual cultivation and indulgence, that an enthusiasm that you notice in China, the way Prime Minister is being conducted there, is of enormous relevance for us because for a long time, last whole 5 years, President Xi Jinping's idea of redefining great power relations had excluded India. It seems now India is in the list. So in that sense, it's a positive signal from Chinese side.
India is in the list, in China's list. Just going over to Ener Tangen. Mr. Tangen, we saw one of the papers, at least, that our reporter in Wuhan had held up for us multiple pictures on the front page, a lot of coverage on it. Yesterday, the People's Daily, for example, didn't have that kind of coverage. It only had Xi Jinping visiting the Three Gorges Dam on the first page, and the summit meeting was on the third page, briefly mentioned. How is the Chinese media really treating this subject, and how are the Chinese people reacting?
Well, I mean, the Chinese media is reacting cautiously. Obviously, they want to see read the tea leaves before they jump out in front. They weren't certain, actually, from the Chinese side, how things would be received from the Indian side. And, you know, obviously, there has been some friction in the past, and they didn't want to make a lot to do out of something if it was not going to be received well. But I think based on the optics that are there, based on the attitude that looking at China as an opportunity as opposed to a threat is part of India's future, or could be, I think is a very important part. I mean, the optics are one thing, and I understand that people think these are carefully choreographed. But if you know the individuals themselves and you study them, there's no reason why Modi and Xi would not bond together. They come from different backgrounds, but they care deeply about their countries. They want to see progress. And this is something that unites these two ancient civilization nations. Remember, these are not nations that were concocted by princes and wars and things like that. They've always had an identity unto themselves. And I think that could be perhaps a strength as they go forward.
Right, Mr. Thangen, you're talking about the two leaders themselves. Professor, now, they are unassailable as of now politically in both their countries. We've just seen what happened at the party congress as well with Xi Jinping. But we're also expecting the Foreign Secretary to brief off record and off camera what exactly was discussed in those meetings. And there's going to be 3 more conversations, yes, possibly. But it's been called expectation management. Or manage expectations. Yes. It's not outcome based. These are two leaders who are getting to know each other's views, their domestic compulsions and their global positions.
I think you're right, because it's basically repeatedly underlined for this informal summit meeting that no concrete outcomes should be expected from these meetings, and they are focused on building mutual trust, chemistry, understandings. And as Prime Minister had said before leaving, for Wuhan heart-to-heart conversations, and that display is clearly convincing in that sense. But we also realize that the need for such a heart-to-heart talk was important, because for last 2.5 years, the whole lot of issues are irritants which are virtually on a dead end, and nothing is moving on that. And that required that you need to build understandings at the very top of leadership on two sides.
And maybe cut out the bureaucracy, the diplomats to a certain extent.
You know, whenever you need to take, let's say, bold initiatives, which are kind of out-of-box thinking and make kind of give and take accommodation on both sides, that signaling cannot happen at official level. That signaling will happen at the very top of political level. And I think that was the requirement when they thought that they need to spend 2 days together, roughly 6 to 7 to 8 hours every day, to just, you know, have focus on understanding each other's mindset, and then how can they explore possibilities of China and India coming together, which is part of the, you know, Europe is becoming autonomous of United States, Asia is becoming autonomous of Western nations in terms of managing development and security issues. So that puts the onus or focus on China and India to really take the lead in tackling at least bilateral issues, and from there, you know, play a regional and global role from there. And that required a kind of a mutual confidence of two leaders who see themselves at helm. I mean, Xi Jinping is going to be there for a long time to come, and Prime Minister Modi has elections next year, but most people expect he might come back. So in that sense, since both of them see themselves in long-term trajectories, the thinking is they need not find solutions tomorrow. At this stage, focus is to manage issues now, but resolve them in due course and find greater role for both countries together in terms of partnering on various issues. Again, in long term, at least they're talking of 15 years time span. In
Chinese
which they
always talk in the long
yes.
term. Mr. Tangen, just coming to you, I know you've written 2 books on Chinese cities. Explain to us the significance of choosing Wuhan. We do know that the Prime Minister has not visited central China so far. He's been to other areas. But Wuhan has both a significance in terms of the present and the future that China is trying to project its cities, and it has a link to the past, to Mao Zedong.
Yes, it does. I mean, it has a rich history, but I don't know that that's the main point. I think it's really about the future that we're talking about. Wuhan is a center for development. It's part of this idea of Belt and Road from the internal point of view. I mean, and this is what they want to showcase. You know, if you start looking at India-China relationship, I completely agree with my colleague. This is about how these nations are going to go forward. I mean, India buying more arms from the United States will not produce more jobs in India. I think Prime Minister Modi is quite cognizant of the fact that he wants to produce at least 10 million new jobs each year, and that it's very difficult without investment. I think the part that we need to talk about is places like Wuhan. How have they achieved what they've done? I mean, this was a sleepy little city, yes, historically important, but what it did is it mastered it understood what its advantages were and then worked with them, not only just by themselves, but as a part of a network, a part of the entire country. And that was coordinated by the central government. And I think that there are things that you can learn, not replicate. India and China will forever be different because they have different ways of culturally looking at things and political systems, economic and legal systems. That's not the issue. The issue comes down to how can India and China, representing 40% of the world's population, with a middle-class population, which is larger than the U.S. and European Union combined, how can they go forward? How can they, as the professor said, how can they step onto the world stage, not as colonial vestiges from a bygone era, but as full partners in creating a better world? And I think it is incumbent on Xi and Modi to figure this out. I mean, and this is not a sudden occurrence. Xi said in 2013 that the relationship between India and China would define the next century. And I think I would completely agree. It's switching from this idea that if you control the money, all right, like the EU and the US have 60% of all the wealth, that you get to dictate terms. Now things are changing because Western markets are moribund. They're just not growing well. 7.5% in India, 6.8% in China is far more attractive. But there is no right for these countries to come in and redo their colonial past and try to subjugate these countries. And I think that's what Xi is presenting to Modi, that together India and China can rebalance the world, bring things back to a point where the markets themselves, the consumer markets, become much more influential in determining the future of the world.
The 2 countries looking forward. Einar Tangen, political analyst and economic commentator, thank you so much for joining us with your perspective from Beijing. And Mr. Tangen was mentioning the other man at the center of the Wuhan dialogue, who's considered China's most powerful leader in decades, perhaps even as powerful as the founder of modern China, Mao Zedong. Xi Jinping's presidency has no term limits now, and at this point, his control over the party and government seems unassailable.
China's President Xi Jinping has many faces. To his people, he is the strong man who has cracked down on corruption in high places. To his party, his vision is driving an ambitious economic and strategic program. But for the world, Xi Jinping is the man who has anointed himself emperor for life. There is no doubt that Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese president in decades. Born a princeling, meaning he's the son of a communist leader who rose to prominence alongside Mao Zedong, Xi Jinping is seen as rekindling policies harkening back to earlier times. Xi has kept a tight grip on power. He is the commander of the armed forces, a new position that grants him the authority to appoint military chiefs. He also heads the Group for Internet Security, the Group for Finance and Economic Affairs, head of the Group for Deepening Reforms. His ruthless campaign against graft has seen the departure of powerful political, military and regional leaders. It is a campaign that seems to have brought popular support. Under Xi, China is also seeking to bring in wide-ranging domestic economic reforms that will boost growth. The Belt and Road Initiative could cement China's pole position in rearranging world trade, but there are challenges and obstacles. Bureau Report, WION.
And the Prime Minister is on his way to the East Lake guest house, where there will be the second day of that informal summit. But these are visuals that have now come in from Wuhan after the banquet. There was interaction there, and it was on camera. Seems to be some kind of conversation there as well. We'll try and get you more on that. We still have Mr. Einar Tangen from Beijing and Professor Swaran Singh in our studios. Professor Singh, we played out that story on Xi Jinping. Now, Mr. Tangen also said that you're looking forward, but Wuhan itself, it has great significance. Mao Zedong used to meet leaders there, Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon at the villa. He would project his young self by swimming across the Yangtze River as well. So is there that significance, or and also because of Xi Jinping and how he's projecting himself within China?
I think there are multiple ways of how the venue is selected. And there are several factors. One, of course, is if you notice that Xi Jinping now is being increasingly compared with Chairman Mao, and the founder of Communist China.
And there's a doctrine already in the making if it's not already there.
Yes. So in that sense, increasingly relating to Mao's legacies is going to be seen as more and more visible in China, and that's why Wuhan. Wuhan also is listed as the happiest city in China. So in that sense, projecting not just the progress but satisfaction and happiness of Chinese people is how also Wuhan was selected. Then for progress and modernization, Wuhan is called Chicago of China.
Correct. The transportation links.
So, so many reasons. And finally, of course, Prime Minister has gone to several other cities in south, north, west. I think this was another important city that he had visited long back as Chief Minister
of Gujarat.
But they wanted to bring him there and then showcase, there are so multiple factors go into how a venue is selected. And I think they are showcasing legacies of Chairman Mao in this case, just like Prime Minister Modi had taken around Xi Jinping in Sabarmati Ashram to showcase Gandhian thinking, Gandhian artifacts, and use them as a method to explain him Indian ethos. So I think in the same sense, the revolutionary spirit of China is being revived and demonstrated for Indian Prime Minister, so that he can link to the great China that they are. And in that sense, I think in some ways, if I could use the word dazzle Indian Prime Minister, with multiple history, culture, modernization, and the economic prowess that they have today. So in that sense, showcasing why should India be really partnering with China, overlooking some of the irritants that continue to be mainstay for us. So in that sense, enormous, as I said, orchestration of impacting the mind of Indian delegation, including Prime Minister, and enormous indulgence, as you notice, of President Xi Jinping. And this has become a new trend of leaders themselves escorting the visitors. And that is a very, very new thing now in international politics, where you see, both Indian Prime Minister escorting foreign leaders in India, and now Xi Jinping escorting Indian Prime Minister in various. He's spending much of his time together.
Sure. In fact, we have the example of another interaction between the Prime Minister and the Chinese President. This is from last evening, a Chinese band playing for the Prime Minister, and the band also rendered the famous Bollywood Ye Vada Raha.